Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Though, you're getting a 2-for-1 special today as I'm going to be talking developer Adventure Island's Tiny Dangerous Dungeons and Super Dangerous Dungeons. That's right, we're going to be plunging into a pair of puzzle platformers so I can hopefully answer the question, were these titles teensy treats or dangerously dreary? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Let's kick things off with the first of the two games I played, Tiny Dangerous Dungeon. Is what I'd say if it actually had any semblance of a story, so let's just skip over to the dungeon delving. Mechanically speaking, Tiny Dangerous Dungeon is a platformer with a focus on puzzle solving and navigating a dungeon which gradually opens up as you acquire traversal-related power-ups. Which is a lot of words to describe something that could typically be succinctly described as a Metroidvania. But here's the thing. I'd argue that the actual execution of these elements are antithetical to the idea. Yes, you're backtracking to another area with a new ability, but the actual order in which you navigate through the various stages is ultimately quite linear. If anything, I actually found myself annoyed by the backtracking because the stage design actually had me constantly flip-flopping between the rightmost and leftmost segments of the map, exploring a few rooms deeper each time in search of the next power-up item or key that I'd need to make progress before doing it all over again. It's actually quite tedious to the point that I wish the game was organized a bit more linearly just to avoid all of the backtracking, as it felt less like an exploration and more like a marathon hike. Which is sort of a shame, because I actually don't mind the gameplay. It starts out simple enough with us controlling our literal adventurer through enemies and trap-laden rooms, doing our best not to get hit since we die in a few. That said, the range of actions you can take does gradually expand, between throwing daggers to eventually jumping on enemies' heads, and even walking on water for peak convenience. Honestly, I love the latter one, since it actually did change how I could backtrack through earlier stages and help to avoid one of the most obnoxious elements in this game. Because Tiny Dangerous Dungeon doesn't kill you when you fall into a pit. Instead, it manages to be more annoying than that, since it resets all the enemies in the room and hurts you. You get to do everything you were just doing, but now, while you're slightly weaker, and potentially you're in a worse spot, like in a certain chest-related room that starts you at the bottom end of a place, where you now have to platform while killing enemies. It was honestly annoying enough to the point that I'd empty out my health so I could clear out a path while I had the high ground, rather than trying to do the whole thing in reverse. And to Tiny Dungeon's credit, it isn't stingy with the goddess statues that serve as full heals and checkpoints. What's more, while backtracking does remain a perpetual pain in the butt, it does, near the tail end, get a bit better as you open up better routes just to slightly dull the pain. Which also did make hunting down the 4 secret trial rooms actually worth bothering with. To be super honest, I actually nearly missed these collectible objects as they are rather well hidden, but the map helps to tip off their presence as it showcases a cortege of inaccessible treasure-laden rooms. Provided you can clear them, they do provide an extra chunk of max health, which makes your climatic confrontation at the dungeon's end all the more feasible. And it does, again, slightly make backtracking a little less crummy. Honestly, I just really wish there were more things like these, though, as they would have helped to ebb away the sense of tiny, tedious filler. But here we are. Still, I do want to give the game credit on its aesthetic front, as far as making something with a Game Boy-looking vibe. They definitely got the job done. It looks pretty nice, though I was a fair bit more invested in its visuals than its soundtrack. Still, I can't say it redeemed the experience as a whole. Ultimately, Tiny Dangerous Dungeon lives up to its namesake insofar as being a bite-sized experience. But so much of that time was spent backtracking, to the point that I gave the game's time trial mode a single glance and then decided that a concerted effort to pretend it didn't exist was in order. That's not to say I hate this game. I think it's alright as far as puzzle platformers go, but the constant backtracking left such a bad taste in my mouth that it left me sincerely grappling with whether or not I could recommend this or to whom, which is ultimately why I rate it as a fumble. Which brings us to our second entry, Super Dangerous Dungeon, which actually has a story, as it kicks things off by putting you in the shoes of a treasure hunter whose ego might outstrip his experience, given he proceeds to fall prey to the first trap he comes across and wind up stranded within the guts of the dungeon. That's your story, and while they aren't anything complex, the animated segments which kick off the dungeon, as well as the 2 bonus dungeons, are at least fairly charming and even serve a mechanical purpose, as they provide a small hint to the obstacles you'll be coming across without overstaying their welcome or wasting a large amount of time explaining their nuances. The small scenes before and after the end of the dungeon segments are just more for fun without taking up too much time, which was nice. That said, what I was really here for wasn't the narrative differences between Super Dangerous Dungeon and its tinier sibling. See, while they share a similar title and genre, the way they're executed is altogether different. To wit, Super is more of a stage-based experience that tasks you with challenging a bit over 60 different dungeon chambers. This narrower focus works rather well, as each chamber is a self-contained puzzle that sees you trying to figure out the optimal path to the room's key and then its exit door, all while avoiding the various death traps given that everything kills you in one hit. It's a very simple formula, since you're limited to jumping around, but the game does a decent job of providing thematically different obstacles to learn and navigate in each of its 6 dungeon areas, which did a fantastic job of keeping me invested throughout the experience. That said, I do have a slight quibble with the boss stages that each area culminates in. Essentially, these are chase segments that see you weaving through an auto-scrolling stage replete with the various hazards which are emblematic of that particular segment of the dungeon. And honestly, I enjoyed the stages as a whole, and yet I did feel there was a bit of a missed opportunity, as each boss essentially boils down to an advancing wall of death and little more. Seriously, as big and showy as they are, they're secondary to these stage hazards, given that they don't have any mechanics unique to themselves and most exist so they can be shuffled off the board in a sufficiently showy manner at the end of each chase scene. Still, I think that's a pretty minor quibble, and that's also because by and large, I really enjoyed my experience. Heck, the fact that there's a checkpoint for each of the various stages is super nice, because not only does it mean you can wander off to explore the game's bonus dungeons, it also means you're free to skim through the earlier stages in search of secrets. Because, well, if you enjoy challenges, there is a corte of bonus stages to discover. Notably, you're actually given hints about where these are at the end of the game, given they're required to unlock the very final area. But honestly, once I bumbled into one, I found myself hunting down the rest, so I'd already had everything by the time I reached the climax. And they are worth doing, as they provide some of the lengthiest challenging rooms to tackle within Super Dangerous Dungeon, alongside the stage which ensues, which, it's tricky. But then, that's sort of the name of the game. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I am actually pretty appreciative of the developer including different death animations for all the various ways you can shuffle off the mortal coil. It made it a bit less painful to endlessly die. Really, as a whole, the game looks fairly nice. That said, if I had to put my finger on what I appreciated the most about it stylistically, it'd actually be the music. There is something distinctly nostalgic about a number of the tracks in the game which perfectly encapsulate the SNES era music, to the point that I was actually grateful for the length of some of the stages, since it meant I got to hear the entirety of it. Which brings us to the end. If it isn't abundantly clear, I think both comparatively and on its own, this Dangerous Dungeon is superb. Unlike its predecessor, where I found myself constantly looping back through the same few rooms with only a small variation on the way in which I navigated them, Super Dangerous provides a healthy selection of chambers to conquer which manage to avoid feeling repetitive. Ultimately, what this meant was even with its relatively short playtime, I found myself thoroughly immersed, and I can safely call this a solid hit. That said, while the game does end on a sequel hook, I wasn't able to find a follow-up, though the developer does seem to have a fondness for platformers, so you may wind up seeing another Adventure Island title on the channel at some point. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other member of Crit Hit, Hop. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.